Today marks the 1-year anniversary of the absolutely abhorrent tragedy that was the Southport murders, and I'm going to put the faces of the little girls that lost their lives on the screen right now because I think it's very important that we continue to remember the innocence that was lost that day and just the severity and the horror that event was. Obviously, post the actual event happening, we saw the riots and especially like the stand up against the police, which is the first kind of reaction of that type that we'd seen in a while, and obviously the event itself was unique in a lot of ways, and people were justified for being angry, as we covered at the time, and I'm going to reiterate now, especially with what I talked about in the last episode of the podcast, which was about, you know, the situation with the migrant hotels in Epping and similar events that we saw there. You know, people have the right to be angry about these things happening, like they did with Southport, like they are now with the migrant hotels. Violence was never the answer because it only makes things worse, really, but I think when we look at Southport, we can push that aside a little bit and truly see the heartbreak that was going on in that community, because something was lost, and the witnesses and the survivors of that incident and like the police officers that were there and directly intervened have talked about that in that way, about, you know, the trauma that they went through and the way it shook the community. But more importantly, what I want to emphasise was the start of the cover-up, and I think that was the first thing that we really saw of that nature, and I think that was the most important thing that we could take from that whole event. You know, obviously, despite the tragedy, despite the loss of those innocent girls, it was the way that the establishment handled it and the way that information that later turned out to be true was kept from us, and the people who were coming up with this information and making these suggestions were called conspiracy theorists and racist and far right, especially with the riots, as we know, which is a term that since then, you know, that was the start of the trend, wasn't it? That was the start of the far right trend starting to be used, and we've seen it so many times in so many different events and contexts since then. But it was the way that now we know that Axel Rudy Cabana had an Al-Qaeda manual on his computer when the police raided his stuff, and the fact that they knew that from the beginning and they kept that from us. And even though people were making suggestions about what kind of ideology he might have gotten into to lead him to want to do this, I mean, obviously we know that he had these weird fascinations with like the Rwanda massacre and just school shootings and all these things, so we know that deep down he was just like a sick individual. But to top it all off, he had got himself involved with this kind of ideology that now we're seeing on a much wider scale. And I think that was, again, really the most important thing that we could take from this whole thing. And we need to remember that, because it's very important that we acknowledge that and we call that out when that happens, in order to prevent something like the Southport murders from happening again. As much as we want to hope that we will never see a tragedy like that again, with the violence against young women and girls and the danger that communities are being put in because of migrant hotels, unfortunately we can't guarantee that something like that isn't going to happen again. And things of that nature have been happening, and we know that they have been happening, and that's why what happened in Southport was the start of the real fight. You know, that we've had some events over the past few months that have really said to us, like, this is the start of the fight, and I think that Southport was one of them. And then what happened with Tommy Robinson in prison was another one, and then when he got out of prison and announced the rally on the 13th of September, which I'm going to echo what a lot of people are saying, including Tommy, that if you can go to that, go to that. And I want to also applaud the people outside that Britannia Hotel in Canary Wharf who have continued to be there outside protesting and calling out what the police may or may not be doing to filter and to manage these people. and the sides that they're taking. And especially with Southport, you know, we saw the side that they wanted to take. So yeah, I just wanted to make this kind of statement about this because I thought it was really important that we highlight that today was, what, 1 year since that happened. And again, just remember the innocence that was lost, the cover-up, and the way that normal people stood up and stood together and were silenced, or at least were attempted to be silenced by the establishment. And yeah, the way that information was kept from us that we then found out was true. And, you know, you can have a discussion in the comments about your own thoughts about all this. And as we remember that event, we also hold in our thoughts the family and friends of the girls that were killed, the girls that survived but will have witnessed that and will probably be traumatised for the rest of their lives. Same with the police officers who were directly involved in stopping him and arresting him, and, you know, the dance instructors that were there, all the staff, just anyone that was involved who will have trauma we hold in our thoughts today. Again, this is just one event that signalled the start of this major fight that we're currently in, and I will see you guys in my next video.